All right, so we're diving into John F. Kennedy today, a figure shrouded in, well, both history and myth, when
Yeah.
you say. I mean, most people know the basics, but today we're going deeper, uncovering what made him a true visionary leader.
Yeah, good thing too. JFK's story, it's been told and retold so many times, right? It's easy to just skim the surface.
Right, exactly.
You need to understand, like, why he still has this hold on us. What made him stand out?
Okay, so picture this. Young JFK, born into, like, serious privilege, powerful family, elite schools. You'd think his life was all laid out, right? Comfort and ease.
You'd think so. But the documentary, it does this cool thing where it contrasts all that privilege with, his wartime experiences. PT-109,
Oh, yeah.
when his boat was sunk and he led his crew to safety. That story, that's not just some rich kid, that's someone facing real pressure and boom, becomes a hero.
Makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like, did he always feel he had something to prove? Even with all the advantages he had, did that fuel his ambition?
Absolutely. The documentary makes that connection, links that drive to his wanting to do public service. It wasn't just like personal achievement for JFK. It was about using what he had to serve something bigger.
So we see him rise through the ranks, right? The congressman, senator. Each step builds his skills, his reputation. Was this just a natural thing, though? Did he just kind of like coast into the presidency?
Not at all. This documentary shows how strategic he was, always thinking steps ahead. Look at the 1960 election against Nixon. Went down to the wire.
Oh, yeah, nail biter.
And those televised debates, they were huge. They show how JFK understood how powerful media was. Like, no politician had grasped that before.
It was like he revolutionized how politicians communicate, right? This was the dawn of, like, media-savvy politics. And he was leading the charge, using TV to connect directly with voters, projecting a certain image. But you still see so much of that today.
Totally. JFK wasn't just some natural charmer. He was a master strategist. And speaking of strategy, think about the challenges he faced as president. The civil rights movement, the space race. Oh, and just that small thing, the Cuban Missile Crisis. We were so close to nuclear war, it's crazy.
Terrifying, right? But he still managed to get major things done, launch big initiatives, inspire the nation. What stands out to you as his most visionary moves? Like, what was it about JFK that made him connect with people on such a deep level?
Well, the documentary breaks it down into a few things. First, his eloquence. It points out how carefully he crafted his speeches. They were like works of art, almost. And even today, some of those lines are still so powerful.
I have to ask, do you have a favorite JFK quote? One that really sums up his vision?
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. That's one everyone knows, but it still gives me chills.
Yeah.
It's JFK at his best inspiring action, making people believe in something bigger.
And he didn't just talk about it. The Peace Corps, right. Pretty tangible example of putting that ask not philosophy into action.
Right, but it wasn't just about action in the moment. The documentary also focuses on JFK's long-term thinking. His ability to see beyond the immediate, like the space race. Sure, on the surface, it was about beating the Soviets. But for JFK, it was bigger than that. It was about pushing human potential, pushing the boundaries of what we could achieve.
And that vision, it's still shaping how we see space exploration today, right?
Yeah.
We're still chasing that dream he articulated.
Exactly. He set a goal that captured the world's imagination, and that's a powerful legacy.
Of course, we all know how it ended. His presidency cut short. It's impossible to talk about JFK without talking about the assassination, how it made him a martyr in many ways, but also how it fueled those conspiracy theories that are still around today.
Definitely. A pivotal moment in American history, that's for sure. One that still fascinates us, maybe even haunts us a little. And the documentary, it doesn't shy away from exploring those reactions, the consequences.
It's like his story became frozen in time, leaving us with that feeling of, like, unfinished business, what could have been. Which brings us to a really interesting question. How much of JFK's legacy is what he actually achieved versus the mythology that's built up around him? What do you think?
That's a great question, and it's one we'll be grappling with throughout this whole deep dive. It's obvious that his charisma and the way he died, it all played a role in shaping how we see him, but we can't overlook his real accomplishments either and the impact they still have today.
Okay, so let's break down those accomplishments then. How did JFK's vision turn into real change? What kind of ripple effects can we trace back to the things he did?
Let's start with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He didn't live to see it passed, but he laid the groundwork. His administration pushed for it hard, made it a moral imperative. And think about the pressure he was under. Even his own party was divided on the issue.
So he was walking a tightrope, trying to keep Southern Democrats happy while pushing for equal rights. Sounds incredibly complicated.
It was. And the documentary gets into that complexity, shows how JFK navigated those pressures. He was evolving on the issue, becoming more outspoken as the civil rights movement gained momentum.
So not a perfect hero, but someone responding to the times, trying to do the right thing in a very difficult political landscape.
Exactly. And that nuance is important. It makes him more relatable, someone who is figuring things out just like everyone else.
And then there's the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? 13 days. Must have felt like forever for everyone involved. It's hard to imagine having that kind of weight on your shoulders, knowing millions of lives are at stake.
Absolutely. The documentary, it really brings home the tension of that time. We were on the brink of nuclear war, one wrong move, and it could have been catastrophic. The lessons we learned from that, like the importance of clear communication, strategic restraint, the willingness to de-escalate, those are all legacies of JFK's leadership during those tense days, and they still shape how we approach diplomacy today.
It's amazing how all these seemingly different things, civil rights, the space race, the Cuban Missile Crisis, all connect back to his core philosophy. He wasn't just reacting to events, he was trying to shape the future. But what about his vision for the world outside America? What was his foreign policy like?
Well, you got to remember, this was the Cold War, big time. The threat of nuclear war was everywhere, like a constant shadow. But JFK understood that military might wasn't enough. He believed in diplomacy, in building bridges instead of walls.
So another balancing act, strength and diplomacy. Seems like that was a theme throughout his presidency.
You got it. And the documentary uses his creation of the Peace Corps as an example. He was sending a message, we're not just about military power, we're about working together for a better world.
It's incredible how he could hold those two ideas at the same time, the need for military strength, but also the desire for peace and cooperation.
It really is, and it speaks to the complexity of his thinking, his understanding of the nuances of global politics. He wasn't afraid to embrace those contradictions, to find a path forward that balanced strength with compassion.
And that's something that continues to resonate today, isn't it? The idea that we can be both strong and compassionate, that we can stand up for our values while also seeking common ground with those who are different from us.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why JFK's legacy continues to inspire us. He reminds us that leadership isn't about easy answers or simplistic solutions. It's about grappling with those complex challenges, those seemingly contradictory impulses, and finding a way to move forward with both strength and grace.
Welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about like JFK's impact on civil rights, the space race, even the way we think about diplomacy today. It's kind of wild how much one president can change things, you know?
It really is. And I think one thing that makes JFK so interesting is that he was working in this crazy political landscape, like super complex, super volatile. It wasn't just about having a vision. It was about knowing how to make it happen, like how to actually navigate all those competing forces and get things done.
Right, exactly. It's like playing chess on a global scale with like really high stakes. And speaking of high stakes, I want to go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis for a sec. The documentary showed how tense those 13 days were, but it also got me thinking, like, what else was going on in the world back then? How did he handle the whole Cold War thing day to day?
Well, remember, this was a time when nuclear war was a real possibility, like a very real threat. It was always there in the background. And JFK knew he had to project strength to keep the Soviets in check. But he also knew diplomacy was important.
So is that balancing act again, right?
Yeah.
Strength and diplomacy, that seems to be a theme with him.
You're right. And the documentary brings up the Peace Corps as an example of this more nuanced approach to foreign policy. He wanted to show the world that America wasn't just about military power, We were also about helping others, building relationships, understanding different cultures.
It's amazing how he could, like, hold those two ideas in his head at the same time, needing military strength but also wanting peace and cooperation. Was that a thing in his domestic policies too?
Absolutely. Think about his stance on civil rights. He was trying to push for change, but he couldn't alienate Southern Democrats. He needed them to pass any laws.
Yeah.
So he's walking this fine line, balancing those pressures.
It sounds like he was always dealing with these tough situations. Did he always make the right call, though?
Well, the documentary doesn't pretend he was perfect. Like the Bay of Pigs invasion, that was a big mistake. It shows that even someone as strategic as JFK could, miscalculate, bad intel and all that. But what's interesting is how he learned from those mistakes, how he changed his approach.
So he wasn't afraid to admit he was wrong and change course.
Exactly. He wasn't stuck in his ways, always learning, evolving, trying to find the best way forward.
That's actually pretty inspiring. Makes him seem more human, more relatable. We all make mistakes. It's what you do after that matters.
Right, and I think that's part of why his story still resonates. We see someone brilliant, ambitious, but also flawed. Someone who struggled with tough choices and didn't always get it right. It reminds us that leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about trying, learning, adapting.
I like that. Takes the pressure off a bit, right? Don't got to be perfect to make a difference. Just got to be willing to try, learn, keep moving.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of moving forward, I think it's worth pointing out that JFK's vision wasn't just about his time. He was thinking about the future, about his legacy.
So how do you think his vision holds up today? What parts of his legacy have really lasted?
Well, for one, I think he changed how we see the presidency itself. Before JFK, it was seen as this like distant, kind of regal thing. But he brought this sense of youth, energy, even glamour to the White House.
True. He and Jackie, they were like American royalty. They projected this image of a modern, stylish America.
Exactly. And they weren't afraid to show their family life, their kids. It made them seem more relatable, more human. And I think that's still affecting how we see the presidency today.
It's interesting how his family life became such a big part of his image, almost like a new kind of political theater.
Yeah, you could say that. And it worked really well. People felt connected to the Kennedys, like they were part of their story. That kind of emotional connection, it's powerful in politics.
But was it all just image? Was there real change happening too?
That's the big question, right? And the documentary argues that JFK's presidency had both style and substance. He cared about image, yeah, but he was also deeply committed to social progress, and he had this bold vision for the future.
So what were some of the concrete things he did to reach that vision? What policies or initiatives had the biggest impact?
Well, we talked about the Civil Rights Act, which, even though he didn't live to see it signed, was a direct result of his work. But his impact on the space program is huge, too. Setting that goal of landing on the moon by the end of the decade, that really fired people up, sparked innovation, and ultimately led to one of humanity's greatest achievements.
It's crazy how that one speech, that one challenge, had such a big effect. It's like he started a chain reaction that changed everything.
Yeah, you're right. It shows the power of vision, of articulating a goal that captures people's imaginations and makes them want to reach for something bigger.
But even with all that, there's still that question of what if? If he hadn't been killed, how different would the world be today? Would he have done even more, or would he have run into bigger problems?
It's impossible to say for sure, but the documentary does a great job of highlighting those unanswered questions, those what ifs that we're still fascinated by. It encourages us to look at history, to examine what was happening during JFK's presidency, and try to imagine how things might have gone differently.
It's like a choose-your-own-adventure with history. Exploring different paths, different timelines, trying to understand JFK's legacy in a more nuanced way. And that actually leads into something I wanted to ask you about. The documentary mentioned some personal stuff JFK went through, like rumors of affairs, health problems he kept secret.
Mhm.
How did all that affect his presidency? How do we, reconcile that image of the charismatic leader with the reality that he was human, with flaws and all?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
And the documentary doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but it does acknowledge those parts of his life, those struggles he was going through behind the scenes. And I think it's important to remember that even the most famous people are still human, with their own flaws and weaknesses.
So how do we make sense of those contradictions?
Yeah.
How do we separate the myth from the man?
Well, I think it's about understanding that leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about trying to do what's right, even when you're under pressure and dealing with your own problems. It's about learning from your mistakes, adapting your approach. And I think JFK represents that kind of leadership, the kind that's inspiring, but also human, aspirational, and relatable at the same time.
That's a good point. It's about seeing the whole picture, the good and the bad. Understanding that even the most famous people are complex human beings. Maybe that's the most important thing we can learn from JFK's legacy.
I think you're right. It's about seeing the humanity in our leaders and maybe even in ourselves. It's about understanding that we can aim for great things even while we're still imperfect.
And maybe, just maybe, that's how we create a better world.
Maybe that's the most powerful part of his story, the reminder that even when things are tough, the human spirit can still achieve amazing things.
Well said. Okay, before we finish our deep dive into John F. Kennedy, I want to remind you that this is just the beginning of your exploration. We've barely scratched the surface. There's so much more to learn.
Definitely. And to help you keep going, we've put together some extra resources you can check out.
But first, a quick break. Stay with us. And when we're back, we'll share those resources and leave you with a final question to think about as you explore more about JFK. Welcome back. So, we've talked about a lot in our deep dive into JFK, right? From his early life, how he came to power, how he dealt with those huge crises, and his impact on, well, everything from civil rights to space. But like we said, this is just the start of your own exploration.
Exactly. And to help you out with that, we've got some resources that'll take you further into the world of JFK.
Okay, cool. So where should people start?
Well, if you haven't seen it yet, the documentary we've been talking about, John F. Kennedy, Legacy of a Visionary Leader, that's a good place to begin. Gives you a solid overview, some good analysis of his life and time as president.
Yeah, it lays the groundwork for sure. But if you really want to get inside JFK's head, hear his actual voice, I'd say check out his book, Profiles in Courage.
Won a Pulitzer Prize for a reason, right? It's a fascinating look at political courage, and you get a real sense of what JFK stood for.
And of course, you can't talk about JFK without mentioning his speeches. Like, his inaugural address is still considered one of the best, most inspiring speeches ever given.
You can find videos online, definitely worth watching. The way he could connect with people, the energy in his voice, it's amazing even now.
It's like you're right there, feeling all that hope and optimism. But if you want a truly immersive experience, you could always visit the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum.
Yeah, for sure. It's an incredible place, tons of artifacts, documents, exhibits. It brings JFK to life in a way you just can't get from a book or film.
So whether you're a total history nerd or just curious about this iconic figure, there are lots of ways to keep learning about JFK. But as you do, we want to leave you with one last thing to think about.
Something to really ponder as you continue your own exploration.
Think about what we were discussing earlier about the mythology around JFK, the image versus the reality.
It makes you wonder, right? Is he still so popular because of what he actually did, or is it because of the image that's been built up over the years?
It's a tough question. No easy answers. But it's worth asking because it makes us think about how we tell stories about the past.
And how those stories shape how we see the present, even.
Right. So keep that in mind as you learn more about JFK. Question everything, look for the details, and come to your own conclusions.
And as always, we'd love to hear what you find.
Because this isn't just about JFK. It's about understanding what it means to be a leader, the challenges of power, and that human desire to find meaning and purpose.
And maybe, just maybe, by looking at all of that through the lens of JFK's life and legacy, we can learn something about ourselves, about how to navigate the world today.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.